Whoa, making a video. A little bit windy again. It's still cold. Ugh, yuck. Anyway, so hot for the day. Yeah, asymmetry argument again. How to word it to suit his semantics. And I'll just say, you know, I think the way he's arguing is kind of obnoxious. Like he has some sort of decisive catch here. And all it is a word catch. Nothing else. Word games. So, you know, I have tried to bring up ways of thinking that I haven't heard any responses to that illustrate the point, sort of making the argument. As a general argument, it's all based on the same argument. I mean, I've pointed out, and I'll point out again, that I was talking about the zero-sum nature of life before anyone in this community, anyway, knew of Benatar and the asymmetry. So, you know, some snarky jerk left a comment. It's just so irritating. I mean, just another misparaphrase. My only point I made in the previous video is that, yes, like Benatar, I was talking of this dilemma of life, that the good of it is getting rid of the bad of it, and that's the truth of it in its function. That, you know, we are chasing the bit of us that has been extracted. We are chasing a bliss, okay, that was taken away. Collecting parts, essentially, fixing what's broken, and that's the nature of the game, that there is no true positive, there's just the absence of the negative. So anyway, and I wasn't saying it to say I did it before Benatar. My point is that I thought of it before Benatar. Shit, idiots. You know, before we heard of Benatar. I mean, it's just a huge difference. I wasn't claiming ownership of a concept. I was just merely illustrating that this concept might have some validity based on the fact that people independently have arrived at this conclusion. I never read Schopenhauer before I talked of antinatalism. So anyway, so to illustrate it, like I said, you come up with all these thought experiments. The effort is to explain the nature of the dilemma, which is like the free will dilemma. We have words that don't really describe the reality. Free is kind of an idiotic word. It has no meaning if you separate it from a kind of restraint. So saying the absence of confinement, okay, makes more sense than to say free. And your confinement would be described as some sort of prison cell or concentration camp, or you're grounded in your bedroom or some other kind of confinement. And that is the freedom. The freedom is relative to the non-freedom. And it's the non-freedom that has meaning, where the freedom is just the absence of the non-freedom. So anyway, so that's where this vocabulary gets a little bit unhelpful. And so you were given, you know, clearly, you know, he couldn't quite understand the idea of absence as being a reality. So something being absent, he couldn't conceptualize that as a reality. So I used the word prevention, and then even that he perverted into trying to prevent. You know, Benatar's argument wasn't about trying to do anything. It would be about preventing, not trying to prevent. So again, you're playing word games. You are misparaphrasing. You're not quoting exactly. You're not playing the videos you're responding to. So, yeah, sorry. that fails, in my opinion. Alright, so let's get to the argument again. So I thought of a way of metaphoring it. If I was given the power right now to produce two human beings, one in absolute desire, gratification, glory, and one in the worst misery. So I was able to produce the happiest person in the world and the most miserable person in the world by snapping my fingers. I was able to produce those two people. I had no obligation to do it. Would there be good reason to do it? And I guess I would argue that I think for most sensible people, the idea of some leering guy whacking off to porn versus somebody absolutely tortured with some hideous condition where the pain just migrates through their body every second, they would get it that, oh, you know, I'm not going to bother snapping those fingers. I'll leave that one alone. So that's sort of an illustration. You see, he's wobbly. It makes it tough for me. Ugh. Yeah, it's my old stroke leg. I just can't. Jumping is always dicey. So I don't know whether I can trust the leg to push with or land with. You know, it's good at neither. Anyway, so once you've established that there's some difference, okay, I guess that would be the argument. And I think we can all kind of understand that. You know, if we had the choice to, you know, destroy a little happy planet of bliss, and at the same time, by destroying that, we get rid of a horrid, awful planet where everything suffers constantly, we'd probably say it's a fair deal. I would say it was a fair deal. Very fair. So that the two are not compatible things, let us call it that. And let us say that if you wish to believe there is some absolute positive, some percentage of positives that are just absolutely positive and that don't involve hunger or horny or desire in some way, some need condition. I mean, these are all important words in this conversation. I mean, you really have to understand the idea of need, and that it is kind of a fact that there's no need to create need. There's no God underlying the creation of the God kind of thing, no motivation without some sort of motivating force. That the need has to exist before the need to create need could exist. It's one of those things again. These are traps of our language. So anyway, even if you were to establish as some percentage, then the Benatar math only changes in the sense that you create some percentage of difference between what you might call the weight, the gravity of negative conditions versus the value or positiveness of positive conditions. And I think you might be willing to concede at least that okay, you maybe you can shave off a few percentage points, but you're not going to fix the asymmetry because it's in the nature of the mechanism. And again, I've sort of tried to illustrate that with examples that human psychology, if we were to say that we have, that nature established a whip-carrot mechanism, that a trick it used, okay, was to make the carrot out of removal of the whip. That the carrots are promises of satisfaction of a negative condition. So, our improvement of a negative condition. And that's sort of the game we're playing. There is no true carrot. There's only removal of the negative. And that's the dilemma that is the source of the asymmetry. Is that you're not comparing the correct thing. The thing that is the problem is the idea of discomfort, not an absence of comfort. It is the presence of discomfort that is the problem. That creates the need of service. That's the origin of the value mechanism. So it is like gravity is a pushing force. Okay, value and ethics is a fundamentally negation of the negative condition. That is the value. The positive is only removal of the negatives. And I think you could understand that also by illustrating that if I was to have two people, one in absolute suffering and one in absolute bliss, and I was to remove suffering, by removing it, okay, I create in the element that was in some horror or awful condition a state of bliss without creating any positive. Just the mere fact that I have removed the fetters, removed the negatives, the automatic byproduct is bliss. And that kind of illustrates the point, where if I degrade the happy person at all, the degrade in circumstance is a trickier, harder to comprehend thing, because if you're not creating a negative but just removing bliss, it would be very hard to calculate what that would mean exactly. How you could possibly do that without imposing a negative. How you could remove any element of bliss without taking something considered valuable in terms of a gratification or a comfort. You can't really degrade somebody's bliss without creating some kind of negative condition. So there's lots of these thought experiments you can play with, and so I play with one. So you have 10 kids, okay, and now you have this power, and I guess my query would be, at what point would you exercise this power? When is it? Because that's really what we're arguing to some extent, to some quantitative byproduct. Maybe we could agree on some absolutes, like it would be wrong if you could snap your fingers and create the two individuals of the extreme condition, that you'd kind of understand that the absolutely blissful person's pleasure would not in any way fix or remedy the abject torture of the other individual. I think you could understand that that would not be a condition you would create. Now, I have used illustrations where I say, show me something in this life experience that I would actually do the injecting of a child with cancer to perpetuate, to create. Football or TV or whatever the thing would be. Would I create it at the price of having to physically actually take a healthy child and give it cancer? My argument is you will conceive of no such value in our value universe of known pleasures that I certainly wouldn't be willing to have at that price tag. Now, that should tell you something if you can also recognize that you yourself are not selfish enough or hedonistic enough to say you would be willing to inject cancer into a child to have some measure of gratification or joy. as it's called. Now, we're not talking about you being tortured or you suffering horribly. No, just you being denied some bliss. Not being in an idyllic state, but just being in some not harassed heavily state. Yeah, and whether you would improve your condition in the blissful direction at that price. And I would argue that you would not. But whatever. Back to the thought experiment of such. So you have 10 kids, and let's do the same thing where you'll just give them different extremes of this bliss. Okay, and in different quantities. So you have the two extremes of the abjectly miserable and the abjectly blissful, in whatever the most positive way you can describe bliss. And then you have the mediocrity in the middle. You know, all kinds of balances where they're just walking around in circles, not terribly happy, not terribly miserable. You know, kind of a description of the average working man who spends most of his consciousness, you know, in some sort of thought trap where he's just trying to pretend, you know, he's not a slave and has some sort of life worth living. You know, kind of a just incredibly mediocre existence. Just walking the path, drone, drone, drone. Not horrible, not splitting, achy pain, but certainly no sense of bliss. Yeah, no comfort, no sensation. I would argue that fundamentally, if you were to have such a circumstance, again, you would always, your attention would be directed to that worst case scenario, the hardest one to do the imposing on. So if you thought about it as straws that you draw, and you pull straws and you hand them to children, I guess my argument to you would be, you would find it, even though we have proportionally given the whole range of life, only one has it the worst possible. Flashy lights. This is a speed trap for which they give notice, which is kind of funny. But that's always the price of paving roads. You know, people do what? Yeah, they speed. Stupid idiots. Anyway, so as you have this little handful of straws divided out proportionally to life experience in some sort of measure, I think, okay, you would have real pause as you got to that shortest straw and were ready to shove that in the hand of some child and say, tough luck, buddy. Yeah, tough shit. You're gonna suffer, and suffer hard. I think that one would be the point where you would have a real problem with the game you're playing, a real problem with this creation game, because it would be very hard for you to look at the kid at the other end humping the pink balloon, you know, with his tongue hanging out, you know, all full of joy, you know, and say, okay, that is worth that. That is worth the chemo horror I'm going to impose on this one. Just think if you're a little bit honest, you can recognize that there's the illustration of the asymmetry. Sorry, the wind is horrendous. Horrendous. Unfortunately, I'm blocking some of it, but damn, it's really windy. At least it's pushing me along. It's a good pushing wind. The ugly part will be walking against it on the trip home. So I think that would be an illustration of this asymmetry. You would get a clue of its existence when you really have to look at these two conditions. So ultimately, getting back to my original argument of the zero sum, it was basically my argument that to gratify me, satisfy all my negative conditions, and put me at bliss, cannot compensate for somebody else's misery. It just doesn't fix it. It doesn't make it go away. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't balance it in any cognizable way, any way I can cognize, any way I can understand. It just doesn't. I'm using up my bliss, because my bliss is a byproduct of the gratification and satisfaction of my conditions of need. So I've already used up the positive value by negating my negatives. And you can't negate two negatives with one positive, is kind of the argument. And that is the nature of life. It is negating negative conditions. That's the game we're playing. It's negate the negative. It is not create positive. And it's at its core. And that's what the Benatar asymmetry states in merely different verbiage, but not verbiage that bizarre or distinct or different to justify what I would claim is your deliberate and willful effort to pervert it based on semantics, to make merely a catch-22 semantics argument. So anyway, yeah, that's probably good enough for this one. I'm out of time anyway. It really is. I wish it was 10 degrees warmer, would just help. I just have to work outside today. Yeah. Anyway, until next time. Such.